Our globe is facing many challenges, and many of these involve how we as humans deal with our environment and the animals it contains. Insect Armageddon, problems with pesticides and bees, destruction of habitats, these are all examples of how people and our management of the environment have serious implications for the animals that live there. Of course, we don't want to cause unnecessary damage to the environment, but to avoid it, we need to be able to predict the consequences of our actions. And the environment is part of a complex system of interactions between different parts, including us as humans, and this means with all these interacting factors, it's very often hard to know what to do for the best. So how can we predict the future better to manage our environment and the animals it contains? Well, sadly, we don't have a crystal ball for this, but we do have ecological models. The big question is, do these models work? Can we use them to predict the future? Animal population models are not new. In fact, scientists have been using these for a long time. And we've even been using them to help us manage. But unfortunately, sometimes we mess this up in a big way. One example of this is the use of the maximum sustainable yield model to predict the allowable catch of Atlantic cod. Now, this was hailed as a breakthrough in scientific management, and the model was used to determine the allowable fish catch over many years. Unfortunately, over a 30-year period, this resulted in a massive population crash. So what happened? This was based on the best scientific advice, but it still went wrong. The answer lies in the assumptions behind the model. It was assumed that the population could be estimated by the fishing catch, but the model failed to factor in the very human element that the fishing industry didn't fish randomly, but only from areas where there were actually fish, until suddenly there were no areas left. By then, of course, it was too late to correct. So why do we use these very simple models even today? This can be traced back to the first ever televised scientific debate in the 1950s between two groups of Australian scientists with opposing views about populations. One group said that the population was controlled by environmental factors. The other group said that the population was self-regulating. Now, the self-regulation camp won. This is often called density dependence. And the reason that they won was partly due to the fact that they could use maths to describe their theories. You can easily write an equation that describes the way populations are self-limiting. So this rigorous science led to the modelling based on a principle called keep it simple, stupid, otherwise known as Occam's razor. Now, Occam's razor is named after William of Ockham, a 14th century English friar, and he created this argument based on theology. He wanted to prove the existence of God. It doesn't really have very much to do with science. But this is a strong and testable approach, and we can use these tests to decide if something that we believe to be true is true. If we make a mistake here, then we accept something as fact when it's not. So we accept a true lie. We want to avoid these. For density dependence, we can make these tests quite easily, just simply by watching, say, insect populations growing in a small enclosure. We quickly realize that they don't grow on forever. They become limited either by the space of the enclosure or the amount of food that they have. So we can show that this hypothesis works, but there is a problem with always focusing on avoiding true lies. To do this means we only focus on what we think is a well-known core of the problem, and as the cod example shows, reducing a problem to the bare minimum can miss the critical parts and the consequences can be very serious. Now, in ecology, this problem's been known for a long time. In 2002, Charles Krebs said density-dependent relationships occur often, but are not repeatable, and are an unreliable basis for predictive ecology. But a few years later, the problems faced originally by the environmental regulation camp in the 1950s overwhelmed them, and they realized that correlations abound, but mechanistic understanding is limited because of long causal chains and indirect effect. So what he really meant here is that because there are so many interactions between all these different interacting factors in the complex system, it wasn't possible to see a clear picture of what causes what. This school of thought expressed the fear that without rigorous scientific constraints, so basically here avoiding true lies, that ecologists would be reduced to being storytellers. But there is another way to look at this, especially considering the threats faced by our environment. This view would say that in many cases warning of what might happen is more important than being sure that something will happen. If we fail here, we feign to warn of something that could happen, and this could be considered as a false truth. Now, in many cases, we want to avoid false truths more than true lies, because the consequence of missing the possibility of something happening can be worse than taking unnecessary remedial action. For example, if we want to prevent forest fires. So if we want to predict the future in ecology, then how do we decide what we include or what we exclude from our models? Traditionally, ecologists eliminate everything that's not important for the central relationship. But with complex systems, there are many more links. Small effects can propagate through the system with unexpected consequences. So we've all heard the idea of the butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon, eventually creating a storm in New York. To deal with this, we need to include much more in our models, but we also need to document what we left out in case what we left out turns out to be important later. So where previously scientists feared that ecologists would become storytellers, in fact, to deal with complex systems, this is exactly what's needed. In the new approach to modelling, mechanisms that we know exist should be included, not excluded from the model, even if we can't see the consequences immediately. This is because these systems change, and these mechanisms may become important in the future under conditions that we don't actually know about yet. So we want to copy the system as closely as possible to be able to use this to predict future behaviour, when by definition we don't know the future context. To do this, we need to tell the story of the system and the story of how we built the model. This is still being rigorous in our science, but also modest in that we know that we don't know everything, and that's obviously impossible. And we accept this, so we describe what we include and what we exclude. Flexibility is the key, using avoidance of true lies to understand the mechanisms, but avoidance of false truth in our overall use of the system. In this way, we can warn of the potentially damaging consequences of our actions, but still are basing it on mechanistic, well-constructed and well-tested science. This philosophy is at the core of the animal landscape and man simulation system, and it's very demanding of ecologists. It requires a lot of information. It also requires a lot of technical ability to put these complex models together. But I think the COD would agree it's worth it. This is the first in a series of scientific videos that the SES Centre is going to produce. So if you're interested in finding out how we include these details in the models and what we can use these models for, then please stay tuned for future videos.